Before we get started, a quick heads up. Presidents Unplugged now has merch. If you want to support the show and represent the podcast in your daily life, you can at presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. That is presidentsunpluggedmerch.com. Now, let's get into today's episode. It's January of 1853. Franklin Pierce has just been elected President of the United States and was preparing to be the 14th president in the nation's history. The future seemed bright. After a long political career, tons of loyalty to his party, and years spent building a reputation as a trustworthy politician, he had finally reached the highest office in the land. But as Franklin Pierce, his wife Jane, and their 11-year-old son Benjamin traveled by train throughout Massachusetts, disaster struck. The train derailed and Benjamin was killed right in front of his parents' eyes. It was a tragedy almost impossible to imagine. Benjamin was the couple's last surviving child after the deaths of his other two sons earlier in life. Pierce blamed himself. Jane believed that politics had brought them to this moment, and as Franklin Pierce prepared to become the 14th president, he was carrying a burden that few Americans could understand. Today we're telling the story of a man who entered the White House broken by tragedy, a politician known for compromise during one of the most divided periods in American history, and a president whose legacy remains one of the most debated in American history. This is the story of Franklin Pierce. Let's do this. Franklin Pierce was born in New Hampshire in 1804. He grew up in a political household as his father had served in the American Revolution and later became involved in state politics. So from an early age, Pierce developed a sharp mind and a talent for connecting with people. He attended Bowdoin College, where he built friendships that would follow him for the rest of his life. And he quickly gained a reputation as somebody who could win people over through his charm, his intelligence, and his personality. Unlike some politicians who rose through fiery speeches or national fame, Pierce earned trust through relationships. People generally liked him. He seemed approachable, he was genuine, and he was dependable. And those qualities helped him climb the political ladder very quickly. He served in the New Hampshire legislature, eventually becoming Speaker of the House, before moving on to Congress and later the United States Senate. Throughout his rise, Pierce became known as somebody who valued compromise, being able to meet in the middle, not going one way or the other, but being everybody's friend. He believed that Americans had far more in common than they had different. At a time when tensions between the North and South were growing in what would later become the Civil War, Pierce remained committed to the idea that the Union could survive if people were willing to work together. After resigning from the Senate for some personal reasons in 1842, Pierce stepped away from national politics for a short time. But when the Mexican-American War began, he volunteered for service and eventually became a brigadier general, also known as a very important person on the battlefield. His military career was not very long, but it increased his national profile and introduced him to Americans outside of New Hampshire. By the early 1850s, the Democratic Party found itself deeply divided. Pierce was kind of in the air about politics after leaving the Senate, but coming back into the war, he realized he might just want to jump into politics again. Slavery had become the dominating issue in American politics, and while many people today assume that political parties were unified on the issue, having one party that supports slavery and one that doesn't. But that was very far from reality. Democrats themselves were split. Some members of the party strongly supported slavery, while others opposed its expansion. The party was struggling to find a candidate who could fit both sides of the party. Well-known figures such as James Buchanan and Stephen Douglas had supporters for the Democrats, but neither could secure enough votes to win the nomination. After multiple rounds of voting, the Democratic Party could not choose their candidate. So delegates turned to somebody that many Americans barely even knew. Franklin Pierce emerged as the compromise candidate, somebody who didn't lean to one side of the party or the other, but could work together and get stuff done. He wasn't seen as belonging fully to either faction of the Democratic Party. He represented something that Democrats desperately wanted: unity. Pierce believed his loyalty should be to the United States as a whole, rather than one section of the country or one section of a political party. That message resonated with delegates. And before long, this unknown politician from New Hampshire became the Democratic nominee. And then, after a crushing defeat for the Whig Party candidate Winfield Scott in 1852, he became the next president of the United States. Pierce's intellect was immediately visible right from the beginning of his presidency. During his inauguration, he delivered his inaugural address that was 4,000 words long, entirely from memory. It was a remarkable display of his intellect, his wit, and supposedly he was also pretty attractive, but I don't think that's for me to judge. Whatever criticisms that historians have of his presidency, few doubted that Franklin Pierce was a capable man. Yet, even as he took the oath of office, the tragedy of Benjamin's death hung over him. Franklin questioned whether his family's suffering, dealing with a train derailment, one of the most extreme things to ever happen to a president. He almost wondered if it was somehow a punishment. And it didn't help that his wife Jane blamed him becoming president as the reason why the train derailment might have happened. Yikes. These emotional wounds never fully healed. And in many ways, Pierce began his presidency carrying personal weight while the nation itself moved towards turmoil. But one of the clearer accomplishments of the Pierce administration came pretty quick, with American expansion. In 1853, the United States completed the Gadsden Purchase, acquiring land from Mexico that today forms parts of southern Arizona and New Mexico. The purchase helped settle border questions left over from the Mexican-American War and opened possibilities for future transportation routes across the Southwest. It was a significant addition to the nation's territory, and it remains one of the lasting achievements of Pierce's presidency. Yes, Pierce sounds like a success. Little did Pierce know that this successful Gadsden Purchase would be one of the only positive things in his entire presidency. Abraham Lincoln was 6'4". Franklin Roosevelt was the president for over 4,000 days. These are facts. But you know what else is a fact? The fact that Presidents Unplugged has an Instagram page. If you want presidential content and overall updates on the show, come to the Instagram at presidents_unplugged. That is presidents_unplugged. I'll see you there. If the Gadsden Purchase represented growth, the Kansas-Nebraska Act represented division. Passed in 1854, this law created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska and introduced an idea called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that the people in a territory or a state should vote if they should support slavery or not. What's more democratic than that? Everybody votes, and together we figure out the right outcome. Whoa, why didn't this work? Instead of this being a simple democratic process, it became chaos. Letting the people decide. What could go wrong? As it turned out, quite a lot. Both supporters and opponents of slavery recognized what was possible. If we can get enough supporters of slavery in these new territories, we can win the majority and get new slave territory. Or if enough opponents of slavery move into the area, we can get new free areas of the country. If enough people moved into Kansas and voted one way, they could determine whether the territory entered the Union as a free or a slave state. Instead of popular sovereignty being a beautiful democratic process, Kansas suddenly became a battleground. People rushed into the territory on both sides of the spectrum. Elections became disputed. Fraud accusations were everywhere. Rival governments emerged. Violence followed. What seemed at the beginning like a democratic solution quickly became a race for control. The conflict became so intense that it earned a new name: Bleeding Kansas. Pro-slavery settlers and anti-slavery settlers clashed repeatedly. Homes were destroyed. People were killed. Newspapers across the country covered the violence. America did not look sound. We looked aggressive. We looked rude. And we looked like we were getting close to a civil war. Americans watched as Kansas became a preview of the growing national crisis that would eventually become the Civil War. Among those drawn into the conflict was a man named John Brown, an abolitionist who believed slavery must be confronted directly. His way to confront this issue directly was by murdering a bunch of people who supported slavery and giving slaves weapons to start slave revolts. Brown not only participated, he threw gas on the fire on some of the most heinous violence that erupted during the period, further demonstrating how extreme people's emotions had become. The nation, by the day, was growing more polarized. Why would we try to compromise? Why would we try to meet in the middle when I can stand with the people I agree with on this side and hate anybody that opposes what I believe? Kansas exposed just how fragile the idea of compromise had become. As these events unfolded, Franklin Pierce faced increasing criticism. What in the world is a compromised candidate turned president gonna do when nobody wants to work together? One label frequently attached to Franklin Pierce was doughface. A doughface is somebody who doesn't really have strong opinions of their own. Their opinions come from others molding and mending them like dough in just the way they wanted. Pierce was seen as a dividing figure more than a unifying figure. Not because he stuck with one side, but because he jumped between sides, trying to find similarities when all people were finding were differences. People wanted Pierce to take a side, but he viewed his job very differently. He believed his duty was not to choose between the North or the South. He believed his job was to preserve the United States at all costs. In his mind, compromise was not weakness. It was patriotism. The problem that more and more Americans no longer agreed with. And as tensions intensified, fewer people wanted compromise. They wanted victory for their side. They wanted to win. They didn't want to be losers. They didn't want to let the other side win. This middle ground that Pierce had spent much of his career defending was beginning to disappear. Pierce also struggled with alcoholism for most of his life, and the personal and political pressures surrounding his presidency did not help that burden. The combination of family tragedy, constant national turmoil, and increasing criticism created a difficult environment for any leader. Yet despite these challenges, Pierce never abandoned his belief that compromise remained as the best path forward. Above everything else, Pierce feared disunion. The nation breaking apart into two competing sections, wanting to win and win and win, and not even thinking about working together. Throughout his career, whether as a state legislator, senator, or president, he consistently searched for common ground. But by the mid-1850s, common ground was becoming increasingly difficult to find. It seemed impossible, but Pierce still had hope. And when the election of 1856 approached, Pierce was uncertain whether his own party would support him for another term. Instead of unifying the two factions of the Democratic Party, he had seemed to pull them farther apart. The answer, if the party would support him, eventually became no. Democrats chose James Buchanan instead, who became one of the most notable presidents in American history for how bad he was. It was not a good time in American history, and the 1850s presidents are all kind of bottom of the barrel. Pierce not even being renominated by his own party was pretty sad. His presidency had become too controversial, and many party leaders believed that a new candidate would offer a better chance of success. So Pierce left office and returned to private life, while James Buchanan inherited a nation moving closer and closer and closer to crisis. But even after leaving the White House, Pierce remained committed to the principles he had always defended. During the Civil War era, he continued to view himself as loyal to the Constitution and the preservation of the nation rather than to a specific section or group. He criticized policies that he believed threatened constitutional principles, which made him deeply unpopular in much of the North. And once again, Pierce found himself isolated. He was unique, but not a likable unique. In an era where Americans increasingly chose sides, Franklin Pierce remained committed to the shrinking middle ground. Many historians have viewed him negatively because of this position, arguing that neutrality during this time in American history was no longer possible. Others see a man who genuinely believed compromise could still save the country. And to summarize Pierce's legacy, that brings us to our word of the day: anomaly. An anomaly is something that doesn't fit the expected pattern. Franklin Pierce was an anomaly. He was intelligent, he was likable, and he was politically skilled. He rose through the ranks of government because people trusted him. He entered office after terrible personal tragedy, but he still had good intentions and a sincere desire to preserve the United States. Yet his presidency is often remembered as one of the least successful in American history. He was a talented politician who struggled as president. He believed compromise could solve problems at a moment when solving problems through compromise was losing its power. He fought for the United States as a whole, rather than for one side. But many Americans increasingly demanded that leaders choose. Franklin Pierce's legacy is extremely complicated, but his story reminds us that history isn't always shaped by the good side and the bad side, the villains or the heroes. Sometimes it's completely shaped by capable people, confronting challenges larger than themselves. And even though we shouldn't be necessarily inspired by what happened during Pierce's presidency, a time when the nation was actively ripping itself apart, Pierce's ideals of unity, compromise, and common ground, under the right circumstances, can change the world. And that is why Franklin Pierce is so important. Tune in next Saturday, July 4th, for a very special 250th anniversary episode, where we'll dive into the American Hall of Fame, where we look at all 250 years of our country's history, looking at the most inspiring stories that defined our country's history. You won't want to miss it. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon. God bless. Thank you for listening to Presidents Unplugged. If you enjoy content like this, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify today to be notified that your favorite presidential podcast has released new content. Now, when do we release new content? Once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe even once a year? No. We release new content every Friday at 1 p.m. for my American enthusiasts to enjoy. Come join me on our dive into making American history the most entertaining and interesting subject to learn every single week. I'm Ty Svensson, this is Presidents Unplugged, and I'll see you soon.